For the 12 years that Harry and I lived together, we lived in a small house across from a beautiful lake. We had French doors in the kitchen that opened out onto a deck where we could watch the weather change and the sun bounce across the waves. The heart of our home, though, was our kitchen table. Harry loved to cook, and he loved to celebrate by spreading out every special occasion he possibly could. He would set the table for any holiday, any birthday, any celebration. His greatest joy was inviting family over or having our friends to gather around the table. And then he would just create the most marvelous feast. I honestly thought over the years that our kitchen table had these magical properties. I felt that if we could sit down across from each other at the table, we could solve anything. And it was where we started the conversations that developed the deep bond that we shared. We spent a lot of time at that table. It's where we started our days in the morning and where we ended our day at the end after our very stressful government jobs. And on the whole, life was good. We had a great time. And then, 6 years into our marriage, Harry got sick. He was diagnosed with a severe and incurable heart and lung condition. When we got back to the house after hearing what the doctors had to say, the first thing we did was sit down at that table across from each other, pour out some wine, and start digesting what this was going to mean for us. Our initial relief at finally figuring out why he was feeling so awful became changed into no disease was going to define us. We would beat this, and that together we would live out the best life we could for as long as we possibly could. This became how we got through all of this. And so we worked at it, and we felt, and we created stories around what this would mean for us moving forward. We gathered people around our table, and we set out the table and set out feasts for them. And it was those conversations around the table that helped us to deal with things as they got progressively worse in Harry's illness. But still, life was good. And then the wonderful treatments he was on became progressively less effective, and the side effects became increasingly more severe, and our conversations started to become more somber. We started to pepper our phrases with, well, what if this happens? And what are we going to do when that happens? And how would we keep going? But once again, it was our friends gathering around the table that saved us. They came in and helped us answer some of those questions. And it was those conversations that nurtured and nourished us as our journey continued. At some point, we decided that things were getting much more worse than we had expected and far more quickly than we had expected. There's a time in an illness when you need to face facts head on. And it seemed like with all the feasts and all the glory we were having, while we're facing Harry's death head on, we were living life more fully than we had done before. And that's what sustained us as well. And so it came to a point where we had to ask for more help. The medical interventions were getting more severe. We needed more trained medical people to come in and help us. And we needed to have support. I didn't know anything about an end-of-life journey when we started this journey with Harry. But I learned by reading. I learned by getting support from people around us. I learned by listening very deeply to what Harry had to say and to what he was too afraid to say. And I learned by listening gently and with a great deal of love to what he would need from me next. As the medical situation worsened, he ended up having more and longer prolonged stays in the hospital and more medical interventions and some really nasty procedures. I would come home alone after spending the day in the hospital with him, and I would sit at that kitchen table alone. And I can tell you that the conversations I had with myself when I was alone were some of the most difficult that I had to face. After one particularly challenging prolonged stay, Harry sat down across from me at our kitchen table, handed me a hot cup of aromatic coffee, and looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Teri, it's time for us to talk about the final steps. What is that going to look like? Where will it happen? And here's what I'm going to need from you in the months to come." Well, the coffee may have warmed my hands, but those words chilled my heart. We had been preparing for this for years. I was not prepared for this. But is anyone, even when you know death is coming, it's still really hard to face it head on, isn't it? And so it was such a challenging thing to be able to walk through that path with Harry. I pulled out everything I had ever learned. We decided that we would need more people around us over and over again, and we brought in different circles of friends this time. And maybe that's him calling to say, what's going on here? He was always bugging me about stuff. Anyway, and now I've totally lost where I am in the talk, but that's okay. So once we figured out that the final phase was there, and we decided we needed to really pull in the resources that were going to get us through this stage, one of the things that we realized is that we needed to pull in the palliative care team and get them to start the process that he would need to get him through to the end of his life. But there was still time for one final feast, and we knew this time we were going to need an even bigger table. And so we went to one of our favorite restaurants where we had some of our bigger birthday and anniversary celebrations. And we brought in those same friends that had stayed with us over and over again around the table. And one by one, they stood up and told Harry stories about how much his life had meant to them. They filled him with stories up to the brim. And even though our hearts were aching with what was to come, we all felt the support that was there through those stories. It was incredible. Now, one of the many reasons people steer away from end-of-life conversations is they're often afraid that by talking about death will bring death closer. Whereas research tells us what actually happens is by speaking about this kind of death in this kind of community, we help each other understand and face what it will be like to deal with our own death or the deaths of those we love. We need stronger people all the time to do this more and more. I'm hoping I never have to stand on a stage again and somebody says, we need a trigger alert because someone's going to talk about death. Because what we want is for it to become normal, for us to face those hard emotions, to have those difficult conversations. I'm not a trained medical profession of any kind. I'm a sister, I'm a daughter, I'm a wife, I'm a mother, and I'm a grandmother. And yes, I'm a widow who's had to face one too many final goodbyes. Now, psychologists tell us that mental resilience is a skill that can be developed that helps us face adversity, trauma, tragedy, and threats and unusual circumstances and I'm pretty much thinking that's what we deal with every day right now with COVID, right? But that ability to have mental resilience is what we need to develop in order to face death gently. And so psychologists tell us it's a learned skill. I say it's an end-of-life skill. And it is something that we need more people all the time to be able to develop. I believe, from what I've learned following Harry through that journey, from our lovely marriage to 12 years later, saying our final goodbyes, that mental resilience is what helped me get through that journey and the support that I had. What you need, though, is to be able to tap into your own resources, your own local hospice associations, grief support groups around you, and your own friends and family. But the biggest thing is to learn to face death gently. We soften the fear of death when we stare it in the face. I do believe we live life more fully when we talk about death more gently and more easily. And I know that this is something that can be part of everyday life. We're facing more death these days than we've ever had to face. And so I encourage you to start the support groups within your own family. Have these conversations with your family and friends. Gather people around your kitchen table. Spread out your best tablecloth. Bring out your best china. Pour the wine. Invite the guests in. And start your own final fabulous feast. You'll never, ever regret it.